Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Susan Madera. I'm Academic Program Manager for High Impact Practices at Queensborough Community College, and I'm also the coordinator of the Common Read Initiative. This year's Common Read is The Road of Lost Innocence by Somali Mom. There are approximately 1,500 students reading this book this semester at Queensborough, and one local high school class reading the book at the same time. The goal is for us to have you think globally. We want you, with the assistance of these co-curricular events, to think across the disciplines. We want you not only to think about literature when you read this memoir, but to think about social issues, to think about how math plays a part in this. Business and sexual trafficking is big business. Nursing, what are the medical issues associated with what's happening in this book? So our goal is to lift you up by educating you. This is a place of higher ed, and that's our goal. Today's event is sponsored by the Males Club, and we're very excited to have with us today Ivy Suriyopas, and she's the director of the Anti-Trafficking Initiative at the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund. Ms. Suriyopas is an attorney and the director of the Anti-Trafficking Initiative at the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund, and she provides legal representation, conducts community education and outreach, and engages in policy advocacy on human trafficking issues. This legal representation includes immigration assistance, criminal justice advocacy, and civil litigation for claims involving the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act, the Fair Labor Standards Acts, and other federal and state laws. Ms. Suriyopas serves as a Freedom Network co-chair and a steering committee member of the New York Anti-Trafficking Network. She co-authored the third edition of Identification of Legal Advocacy for Trafficking Survivors and the first edition of Immigration Relief for Crime Victims, the U-Visa Manual. She is a recipient of the New York City Bar Association's Legal Services Award. Her previous legal experience includes externships with the Honorable Martin J. Jenkins of the Northern District of California and the ACLU of Northern California. She served as co-editor-in-chief of the Hastings Race and Poverty Law Journal and studied international human rights law in South Africa through Howard University. She received her JD from the University of California, Hastings College of Law, and her BS in Policy Analysis and Management from Cornell University. Please join me in welcoming our guest speaker, Ivy Suriyopas.
I decided to use the mic because I think it's a little bit easier so I don't have to strain my voice. Can everyone hear me? Yes. Great. So as Ms. Madera said, I am an attorney working in the area of human trafficking or anti-trafficking issues for almost 9 years now. And I understand that Queensborough has had several events throughout the semester on human trafficking. And I wanted to poll the room a little bit before starting on how much everyone knows about trafficking. So can I get a show of hands about how many people have actually heard of human trafficking? Okay, how many people have heard of what's been called sex trafficking? How many have heard about labor trafficking? How many have heard about child labor? Sweatshops? The Trafficking Victims Protection Act, 0. The Fair Labor Standards Act. How many have heard about raids of brothels looking for trafficking? Has anyone read Nicholas Kristof in the New York Times and some of his stories about trafficking? Okay, so I think we're on the same page in terms of your exposure to this issue. I myself have been working on this issue for quite some time, and I'm very excited to be here today. I know it's been a long day for many of you, so I'll try to make this as an engaging conversation as possible on the issue of trafficking. So first, I wanted to show a word cloud of some of the words that people think of when it comes to trafficking. You'll see that I put human rights at the center. This should always be at the center of any kind of discussion or dialogue about trafficking, because trafficking really is a violation of those human rights. Human rights are what we have decided as a society, as a world, about what everyone's entitled to, regardless of where they came from, how much money they have, where they were born, right? And trafficking violates some of those tenets. And then also amongst the words here, and I'm not going to go through all of them, are some of the words that people think of when they think about human trafficking. This is a list of rights that people in this country and theoretically throughout the rest of the world are entitled to when it comes to your working conditions. You're entitled to minimum wage. In this country, right now, the Fair Labor Standards Act, which applies to the entire country, provides for the minimum wage to be, who knows? What's the minimum wage right now? Yes, sir? $8.50? It's a little bit lower than that for the entire country. Lower than that. 8? 7? Across the country, one more. 7.25. Across the country, all 50 states and the District of Columbia, the minimum wage is $7.25 right now. Congress is deciding on whether to raise that, but right now it's $7.25. And in New York and other states, they have the choice of raising the minimum wage a little bit higher than the federal minimum wage. So in New York, it can be $10 or it could be $20, whatever a particular state decides. I believe right now the highest minimum wage is in Washington State or Seattle in Washington. And I think it's almost $15. It's something very, very high. Okay, so you see there are a number of rights that everyone's entitled to, and this is regardless of, again, where you came from, how much money you have, who you are. These are rights that our government provides for. So minimum wage, overtime if you work over 40 hours a week, freedom from discrimination and harassment, hostile work environment in the workplace. Also, I wanted to highlight the very last point here, right against retaliation. So you have a right to complain if you have any of those rights violated, any of these rights violated. And the employer is not allowed to retaliate by firing you or demoting you in some way, shape, or form. So it's very important that people are aware of this so that they feel free to be able to speak about their working conditions. Why am I talking about labor rights right now? Can someone venture a guess? So I'm talking about labor rights because trafficking at its core is about violating many, if not all of these rights in the workplace, regardless of what industry you work in. So defining terms, what is human trafficking? A lot of you might have seen movies about trafficking or seen Taken with Liam Neeson, right? And you think, oh, that's trafficking. But you'll notice from this definition, and it's not the legal definition, but it has these three terms, which are part of the legal definition: force, fraud, or coercion. Force is where someone is being kidnapped or chained up or physically being incapacitated in some way, shape, or form to force them to do something against their will, to work against their will, right? If you want to think of media images or whatnot, or historical examples, that would be historical slavery in this country. Fraud, where someone is told about what their working conditions might be, and then it's very different once they actually start working. So the pay is grossly less or maybe non-existent, or maybe the hours are, you have to work 24/7 instead of 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. Those are working conditions. And then coercion. This is the most difficult term because it's very difficult to define. But basically, that's where someone is being threatened, either with harm to themselves or harm to loved ones. Maybe there's abusive process, meaning someone's threatening to deport another person or use the law in some abusive way to coerce them and intimidate them, really to try and create a climate of fear in the workplace. Okay, so this is for all human trafficking. Notice force, fraud, or coercion. Now, this is what has been called labor trafficking. Not as many people know about labor trafficking as they know about sex trafficking. But trafficking into labor industries, notice, requires force, fraud, or coercion. So that's someone who's working at a nail salon, as a domestic worker, as a farm worker, as a sweatshop worker, in a garment factory, someone who is working construction or a hotel or restaurant. If they are being forced to work against their will, because they're physically being forced, because they've been defrauded in some way, or because they're being coerced, they may be a victim of human trafficking into a labor sector, so labor trafficking. Okay, and then you'll see these words. These are legal terms: involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, slavery. We know what slavery is. Debt bondage is where someone might have a debt, an alleged debt on their head. You have to work for me until you pay off this $80,000 debt. And you accrue interest for every day that you don't pay me. And the interest is 20%. And you also owe me for the house, the shelter I provide over your head, or for the food that I provide you. All these things keep adding to the debt. And so it keeps, there's no finite end. There's no clear distinction of when the services are over. That might be a debt bondage situation where the person continues to work because of this supposed debt that they have. Peonage and involuntary servitude are very similar to slavery. Someone who is being coerced to work against their will. Involuntary servitude in particular is a term used for domestic workers who are being coerced in the household to cook, to clean, and to take care of children. Now, this is a term that maybe most of you have heard of, also called sex trafficking. And notice, again, it says force, fraud, or coercion. So for all forms of trafficking, you have to show force, fraud, or coercion unless you have a minor engaged in prostitution. So if you have someone who's under 18 who is trading sex for money, that person is a victim of trafficking under the law. But if the person is an adult and they're engaging in sexual services, whether it's exotic dancing or straight up prostitution or other sexual services, unless they're subjected to it through force, fraud, or coercion, it's not trafficking. Okay? That's an important distinction to be aware of. So this is another way to kind of see or visualize trafficking. Does anyone know what labor exploitation is? We were talking about at the top of this presentation about all of your labor rights, right? Right to minimum wage, right to overtime. So labor exploitation is when you are deprived of that. So like a McDonald's worker who's not being paid overtime pay, even though that worker's working 50 hours a week. They're not getting $14 or $15 for each hour worked over 40 hours a week. Okay, if they're denied overtime pay, that is a labor exploitation scheme. But if the person is not only not being paid minimum wage, but their passport's been taken, or their family in their home country is being threatened, or they have to work continually to pay off a debt, and so they never see a dime for all the work that they're doing because they have to work off this debt. That sounds like a trafficking scheme. And so if you think about trafficking as existing within all of labor exploitation, you can see that trafficking is the most severe form of labor exploitation, regardless of industry. Here's another visual. If you think of it as a spectrum, human trafficking on one end, decent working conditions on the other. This is someone who's being paid minimum wage or higher, overtime. Maybe they have health benefits, they have vision and dental, they have all the nice little package, vacation and sick days that a lot of us aspire to. And then a human trafficking survivor or victim is someone who doesn't have any of that. And labor exploitation is somewhere in the middle, this gray area. This is a statistic from the International Labor Organization, which is an agency of the United Nations. And they estimate, I think the statistic is from 2 years ago, that there are almost 21 million people worldwide who are being trafficked. The term they use is forced labor. And if you look at the report, they have a breakdown of the different components of forced labor or trafficking. This includes men, women, and children, males and females. Here is the breakdown for trafficking according to the ILO. Okay? The vast majority are trafficked into labor industries. Those labor industries are the ones I mentioned before: construction, farm work, restaurant work, bricklaying, chocolate picking, or whatnot. This is into the sexual industry. Again, this is worldwide. And then this last section here is for state-imposed forced labor. So people who are imprisoned and have to provide labor. So the ILO considers that part of the forced labor description. Okay, and this is all, if you add up all those numbers, that should be 21 million people, or 20.9. So I'm going to reiterate some of the different industries in which we see trafficking occurring. Factory work, sometimes called sweatshops. Hotel work. I've had a couple cases walk in the door of workers who come on what are called H-2B visas, temporary guest worker visas, to work in hotels as housekeepers, and they have trafficking claims. Construction work, agricultural work, huge, huge problem, especially in Florida, California, upstate New York. Domestic work. The majority of my cases actually involve domestic workers, including those who've been trafficked by diplomats. Of course, the sex trade, those who are subjected to force, fraud, or coercion. Child soldiers. The international definition includes child soldiers because these are children who are being forced to do something against their will. So here are some indicators of trafficking. Now, it's a long list. It's not an exclusive list. But if you see something where someone might meet several of the elements on this list, you should probably look into it or report the situation to law enforcement, the police, okay? Obviously, someone who's being paid very little or not at all. Someone who's working extremely long hours. I've had clients working 18-hour days, 7 days a week, no time off. Withholding of documents, that can include passports, driver's license, other essentials that you need. Isolation. I've had clients who are not allowed to have a cell phone, or if they have a cell phone, the bill and all the calls are tracked to the trafficker, so the trafficker can monitor all those phone calls. Or I've had some traffickers who will stand there and listen to the phone calls that the worker is making. Obviously, threats to the person's self or to loved ones, and other forms of abuse or coercive behavior, anything to intimidate the worker into complying and to doing as the trafficker or employer wants them to do. Climate of fear is not a legal term. It's a term of art that a lot of advocates like myself use to describe the environment in which the worker or the survivor is suffering from. It's a situation where the employer is doing whatever he or she can do, or the trafficker is doing anything they can do in order to intimidate and scare the worker into being compliant. Obviously, physical harm, that's force. Threats, that's coercion. threats of deportation, that's abuse of legal process. These are all kinds of methods that have been used. There may be others that I haven't seen or that my colleagues haven't seen. But anything where the trafficker is actively doing something to make the person feel fearful that if they don't do as they're told, there's going to be consequences. Okay? These are some of the vulnerability factors that we see in a lot of our clients. Person might be a foreign national. Person might be limited English proficient, speak very little English. Person might be very young, like a child, or very old, like a senior citizen or older adult. Person might have very little education. I have several clients who haven't gone past second grade. They might have limited immigration status. They might be undocumented. They might be on a certain type of visa that limits them to a particular employer, and they can't leave that employer because of the terms of their visa. They might have cognitive disabilities, someone who is mentally challenged in some way, shape, or form. And in other situations, emotional vulnerabilities might be a factor. So in addition to the employer or trafficker doing whatever they can to create this climate of fear, oftentimes what helps the trafficker to take advantage of the situation is a worker who might have some or all of these different elements together. And when you have those all combined, it oftentimes leads to something beyond labor exploitation, and it crosses over in a trafficking situation. Here's another statistic from the ILO. And I know there are a lot of stats out there, about the domestic statistics in the United States. This is international. What we have seen on the domestic side of things is that there's very, very little concrete data about what's happening in the United States. And even the State Department has stopped reporting on the estimated number of those who are trafficked into this country or within this country. So these stats have been relied upon by the State Department and other advocates to show that the majority are adults, but a quarter are children or minors under 18 years old. Do I have a question? No, okay. Here is a distinction. Yes?
I'm sorry, I was going to ask, so how does the person that's illegal in this country deal with that?
Someone who's undocumented?
Yes.
Deal with what? I'm sorry.
Deal with the human trafficking. How can they go to authorities? Because what do they get reported?
So that's a good question. If you're undocumented and you report allegations of having been trafficked, law enforcement authorities theoretically are not supposed to put you in proceedings to be deported. And I'll go over the remedies that are available for nationals who are undocumented as well as those who are US citizens. Yes?
I wanted to ask, why have they stopped reporting it?
Reporting?
You said they stopped.
Oh, the State Department.
The numbers.
Right. So
Documenting, right.
the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which is the federal law that outlaws human trafficking in this country, came into being 14 years ago in 2000. And part of that law's requirement is that the State Department has to issue what's called the TIP report, Trafficking in Persons Report, every single year. And that report will be basically a report card of all the countries and how they're doing combating trafficking. And under Hillary Clinton, Secretary Clinton, our government started recording a couple years ago the US's own report card on how we're doing to combat trafficking. When that report started being issued, they would include estimates about how much trafficking is happening worldwide, how much is happening domestically. But once the domestic statistics came into question because of the methodology that was used to reach those numbers, the State Department stopped reporting them because it would be irresponsible to continue reporting those numbers. I think they estimated domestic trafficking to be tens of thousands, 18 to 20,000 annually. And then there was the New York Times Washington Post article that did research into how that number was reached. And they traced it back to some CIA agent who just multiplied some numbers. That person didn't actually use research or social science to extrapolate the estimated number of those who are trafficked within this country. But the UN took the time to research that number internationally, and that's how they came up with these numbers. So until our country, whether it's a government study or a private study, is able to establish a sound way to calculate that number, advocates like myself are very reluctant to show domestic numbers. Okay, so moving on, majority are female, slight majority, 55%. The rest are male, so men and boys can be trafficked. And it's not just boys, men too. And then this is the breakdown per region. Okay, you'll see Asia by far is the leader in terms of the calculated or estimated number of trafficking victims and survivors. When we say developed economies and European Union, that's referring to the United States, Canada, and Western European countries. The Middle East is pulled out from Asia, even though technically it's part of Asia. And yeah, you have the breakdown here of trafficking that happens not only across international borders, but also within their borders. So like within India or within Mexico. So this is the breakdown between international trafficking, cross-border trafficking, and internal trafficking. Cross-border means someone who's brought from country A to country B to be trafficked as part of a trafficking scheme. Internal trafficking means someone went from city A to city B, all within the same country. Is this me? Hello? Okay. So that's important to note. When you think about trafficking, should I use this one? Okay, thanks. When you think about trafficking, migration is not necessary. Trafficking does not mean smuggling. Trafficking means forced fraud or coercion in the workplace, someone who's forced to do something against their will in the workplace. So you don't have to come from the Philippines to be trafficked. You can be trafficked right here in the United States. And so this number shows the majority are trafficked within their own country, and then a good portion, the rest of them, are trafficked, the flip of that, trafficked internationally. These are the top 10 sending countries according to the Vermont Service Center. The Vermont Service Center is the sole adjudicator for immigration relief for trafficking victims. If you're a foreign national who's been trafficked and you're undocumented or you have a visa that doesn't allow you to stay here, and you're facing some kind of threat overseas and you can't return to your country of origin, you can apply for immigration relief to stay in the country, like asylum, right? It's called a T visa. And the Vermont Service Center is part of Homeland Security, and they're the only office in the entire country that will adjudicate all of those applications. And that office, because they have everything together, is able to calculate or show us the top sending countries that are bringing or trafficking people within the United States. Obviously, this does not include US citizens or legal permanent residents who have been trafficked. Top countries are the Philippines, Mexico, and Thailand, at least for this period of time. On certain years, the top countries kind of shift because some cases will have hundreds of workers. I'm currently working on a case involving 500 Indian workers who were trafficked to the Gulf region after Hurricane Katrina. And that particular year, India was not number 4, I think it was number 2 on this list because of the hundreds of workers that were brought through that system. Do I have a question here?
Yeah, where do you go to apply for that relief thing? Is it just like you check online and do other stuff, or is there a specific building in every state, or where is it?
To apply for a T visa or a U visa, which is a form of immigration relief for crime victims, including trafficking, there are advocates around the country, usually nonprofits, that can assist you. I'm part of the Freedom Network, and we have 40 members who all assist trafficking victims and help with T visas. The government doesn't apply for those visas themselves or itself. You have to work through an attorney who hopefully is trained in how to apply for this type of visa. I don't have a slide for this, but I'll just describe it for you. The T visa, in order to qualify, you have to show that you are a victim of a severe form of trafficking in persons, that you were trafficked here with the United States or US territory, that you would experience extreme hardship if you were removed from the United States. And the fourth element is you have to be willing to cooperate with law enforcement. That means you have to report to the feds, whether it's ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or the FBI. It means you have to sit with a US attorney or someone from the Department of Justice to report your allegations. So it's a very, very high burden to meet to apply for this type of visa. And I do have some slides to show how many people are applying and how many people are actually getting this type of visa. So this is a list of the different remedies for someone who's been trafficked. I broke it down into federal and state. So federal, there's the TVPA, the law that's given me a job basically, the Trafficking and Victims Protection Act, Fair Labor Standards Act. That's for obviously labor exploitation, if you're not being paid minimum wage and overtime, but obviously it still applies to someone who has been trafficked. Violations of contract law, right? If you sign a contract to come here, or if you sign a contract here in the United States for employment, and then your working conditions are completely different from what you were promised, that's a violation of contract law. I also included Violence Against Women Act. That is a form of relief typically for domestic violence victims and survivors. But we've had cases of usually wives who married into families or married their spouses, and they were subjected to violence, domestic violence, and forced to basically become servants, domestic workers in their own household. In those kinds of cases, it's called a servile marriage situation. Some people call it mail order bride. That person might qualify not only for a T visa, but maybe also VAWA, Violence Against Women Act. And that's another form of relief for a victim in that situation. And then New York, as of last year, all 50 states have laws against trafficking, and New York passed ours in 2007. And these are some other laws that also were helpful. Like New York was the first state in the country to pass the Domestic Worker Bill of Rights. As I said, the majority of my cases involve domestic workers. This is a law that provides for domestic workers to basically have the same rights as other workers. When FLISA, the Fair Labor Standards Act, passed in the 1930s, domestic workers were not entitled to overtime. They were not entitled to protections that other workers get. And so this Bill of Rights puts them on par with other workers. Now we just need one for farm workers, because farm workers also don't have the same amount of rights as everyone else. So I wanted to provide some concrete case examples. In 2008, I had a case involving Marichu Balanan. She's a domestic worker who came here to the United States thinking she was coming to work as a nurse. She met a woman in the Philippines, thought she was basically meeting someone who could help her get a visa to come here. She paid tens of thousands of dollars to come here, half of what the woman wanted her to pay. The woman got her a visa and brought her to the United States. Then when she arrived, there was a driver waiting for her at JFK, brought her to a house, and there the woman was waiting. Turned out the woman was the wife of the diplomat for the United Nations from the Philippines, Laudo Baja. And she said, because you still owe me the other half of the payment, you have to work for my husband and me until you pay that off. And she spoke very little English. She'd never been to the United States. She never left the country before. This woman took her passport, didn't pay her anything. She didn't know who to call for help. She didn't know 911. She was not given a cell phone. She was not allowed to use their telephone. She was not allowed outside unaccompanied. So there were all these circumstances that really were designed to control her. But they didn't chain her up. They didn't hold a gun up to her head. They didn't lock her up in the basement or anything. But they controlled her. And until one fateful day when she took the risk of answering the phone while the diplomat was working in his office. On the other end of the phone happened to be a Filipino who spoke her language. And she talked to her very quickly and explained, she cried and she said, "I'm trapped, please help me, I don't know what to do." And that led to a series of events that facilitated her escape. Now, her situation happened because I just happened to have done some outreach for a Filipino organization that she eventually called. And that organization knew about labor exploitation. They knew about minimum wage and overtime, but they didn't know anything about trafficking. And it wasn't until I trained them a month before, literally weeks before, did they learn about trafficking. And then I get a call from them and they said, "We have a woman and I think she might be trafficked," based on everything that I told them about trafficking is. I met with her, we reported to law enforcement, we got her a T visa, and through the T visa we were able to bring certain family members out of the Philippines. And after she was reunited with her family, we filed a civil suit against the diplomat, his wife, their adult daughter, and the wife's agency that facilitated her travel to the United States. And we filed a suit that lasted 3 years until we settled. And she's one of the few survivors at the time that was willing to come out and show her face and share her name about her experiences. The problem was, at first when we filed the suit, was that of course the diplomat asserted diplomatic immunity. He said, "I work for the UN, I'm the permanent representative to the United Nations, and you can't sue me because it's a violation of the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations." And it just so happened we filed our suit after he left that post. And because of that, he was no longer protected by full diplomatic immunity. He had limited immunity and we were able to pursue our case. And that's how we were able to settle eventually. So she's one of the lucky ones who was able to come out after someone just happened to be educated on trafficking. And now she's safe outside of that home and with her family. We have another example, and I won't go through the entire detail. I'm sorry, this is very text heavy. But this is the case I mentioned earlier about 500 workers from India who came on temporary guest worker visa program. This case has probably a dozen attorneys, a dozen firms across the country working against Signal International. The EOC filed a case, we filed a case, and then a dozen other firms filed other cases for the almost 500 workers that were involved. And basically what happened was Signal, their attorneys, some recruiters, all worked to recruit workers from the Middle East and India to come be welders and fitters to repair ships in the shipyard in the Gulf region, in New Orleans, in the Gulf region after Katrina. And what they found was, and they were promised green cards in the process, and they were promised that they would be able to bring their families. But once they arrived here, they lived in what were man camps. They were living 24 people to a room, probably half the size of this room, in bunk beds with only 2 bathrooms. and they were still being charged for housing, the equivalent of like rent for a 1-bedroom apartment. So they were constantly being had constant deductions from their pay in order to live there and also work there. And only Indian workers were in these man camps. And they were so secured and isolated that they had to ask permission to leave the area. They weren't allowed to have alcohol. They were completely controlled. And so, because of those circumstances, one of the workers actually attempted suicide because it was such a severe situation. And eventually, they were able to seek assistance, and that's why we have so many cases now against Signal. I wanted to provide one more case example. Has anyone heard of an Ohio case involving a mentally challenged woman and her baby that were locked up in a basement? No. In Ohio, there's a woman who was at a convenience store, and I think she tried to shoplift something in order to get caught by the police and explain her situation, that she was being locked up in the basement of a house, and she had a baby, and she was constantly being threatened with a pythons and some pit bulls or whatnot in the house by 3 people in that house. And they basically forced her to become a domestic worker, and they stole her public assistance checks because she was a mentally challenged individual. This is a US citizen. That's someone who's born and raised here. But she also was trafficked, and just a couple weeks ago, all 3 of those individuals were convicted for trafficking. So even though the examples I provided earlier involve foreign nationals, I want it to be very clear that you can be trafficked regardless of your immigration status. She had cognitive disabilities, she was vulnerable in other ways, and that's how they were able to take advantage of her. And they did whatever they could to create that and cultivate that climate of fear against her. Sorry, how am I doing on time? Okay, I have 7 minutes. Okay, so I'm gonna rush through some of these graphs. This is the graph I promised, showing the number of T visas applied for versus the ones that are actually granted. The blues show less than 1,000 are applied for every year, and even less are granted. That's the yellow. Okay, so this is not a form of relief that's very easy to get. It's a very high burden to meet when you're trying to prove someone has been trafficked. This is a graph showing families and how many have gotten Ts. U visas is a form of immigration relief for crime victims. So if you've been a victim of felonious assault and you're a foreign national who is undocumented, or trafficking or domestic violence, you can apply for a U visa. That's something else that is available for exploited workers. So in New York State, you'll see how different these 2 bars are. In New York State, and the NYPD has confirmed this, law enforcement is always looking for sex trafficking. They very rarely look for labor trafficking. And so as a result, you have only 1 case of labor trafficking ever convicted in New York, compared to the sex trafficking cases that are identified. This is a problem for advocates like myself and my colleagues, because the majority of our cases involve trafficking into labor industries. So very quickly, I wanted to offer some suggestions on what you can do. How many people have heard of the term end demand? No one. Okay, that's good. So when I engage in talks about trafficking, a lot of folks focus on prostitution. And they talk about very, very limited form of trafficking, when I address all forms of trafficking. And when I think of trafficking, I think of prevention, and I think of services for my clients. This is one exercise that the State Department has created for their website. I actually don't have the website listed here, but they have an app where you can, I think it's slavery.org. Sorry, it's on the State Department's website. You can go to that website and you can see how many slaves are working for you. How many slaves created your shoes, your shirt, the chocolate you eat, the diamonds you wear, all of these things, okay? And it's a very thought-provoking exercise, actually, to think about how you might be complicit in trafficking, because along the supply chain, at any point, for all the things that we carry and that we wear and that we do, we're impacting or we're impacted by someone's exploitation. So these are some services and goods where there's documented child labor and forced labor. Chocolate, cotton. In Eastern Europe, there's, I'm forgetting the country. Cotton is very well documented as being picked by child labor. Garment factory, this is Rana Plaza. After the collapse of the factory, hundreds of people were killed. Fishing industry in Thailand, it's infamous. If you Google trafficking, Thailand, and fish, you'll find a ton of articles about the fishing industry, and particularly with Burmese workers. Bricklaying in India, gold, sweet potatoes, right here in the United States, okay? Ethical consumption or conscientious consumerism. Think about the products that you're buying or the goods that you're consuming, and do some research. There's a website called goodguy.com. They also have an application, an app, if you have a smartphone. And it's pretty interesting because what you can do is either go to the website or you can use the app to scan a barcode. And it'll give you a grade of how the product was created, whether it was environmentally safe, tested on animals, or used with forced or child labor. Free to Work is another application and website that also does the same thing. They do it a little bit differently. I don't think they actually have grades. I think they actually, oh, they do have grades. But it's an A through F rating as opposed to numbers. And then I also want you to think creatively about how to address this problem. You know, if you do discover that, like, Hershey's has child labor or forced labor in their supply chain, and you don't want to eat any more Hershey's chocolate, well, think about what happens if you just boycott, right? If you boycott, that means you're hurting the industry, you're hurting the company, but you might also be hurting those workers who might be making very little, but they might be making nothing at all if they didn't have that job, if they didn't have that work. So there's this interesting organization, Coalition of Immokalee Workers in Florida. They have a long history of working with farm workers. And instead of boycotting, they actually have engaged in a fair food campaign where they work with all the members of the supply chain to get them to agree to raise the rate of pay for workers. It's called the penny per pound campaign, where they're basically asking, you know, Taco Bell or Trader Joe's to agree to push farm employers to raise the pay for farm workers 1 penny per pound. Okay, that's all they're asking. But that translates into a lot of money for the workers. So that's another creative way of thinking about how to address this problem, rather than straight up boycotts. As I mentioned, I'm a member of the Freedom Network. If you want to learn more about organizations like the Asian American Legal Defense Fund, or here within New York, we have website, Twitter, Facebook, etc. And this is my contact information. Okay, so I don't know if I have time for questions. We have no time for questions, but if anyone wants to come after, feel free. Thank you.